Hi, this is Pastor Munya of revivalrev.com. Before I get into today's presentation, which I feel is one of the most difficult and yet beneficial presentations that I've ever made, I want to take this opportunity to thank those that have taken the time to leave a comment, to share an opinion, or just simply to share something personal on our website. In the last 2 to 3 years, we've received over 4,000 comments on our website. Yes, that includes some spam and some soliciting emails, but I want you to know that every comment has been read, and I want you to know that your comments are not taken for granted. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to share and to leave your comments. I came across a statement that said that death is not necessarily the opposite of life, but death is a part of life. And the author was suggesting that if the rapture takes place 200 years from today, 300 years from today, that physical death is inevitable. Physical death will take place. I'm not talking about spiritual life. I'm talking about physical death. And even though physical death is supposed to be a part of life, for most of us, death is like a thief that comes at night. It comes unexpected and unwanted, and we struggle to grasp or to understand death or to cope with the grief and the sorrow that ensues after a loved one has passed away. And the reason that I say that this may be one of the most difficult presentations that I've ever made is because I am not sharing out of head knowledge. I'm not sharing things that I've read in books. I am sharing from the core, the depth of my heart. I'm sharing things that I've experienced. And in this presentation, I want to talk about death and how to cope with grief and sorrow, especially after a loved one has passed away. When Dean Martin passed away, Shirley MacLaine and Frank Sinatra both made comments at his funeral. And both of them made a comment that I found very interesting. They say that Dean Martin had actually given up on life years earlier before his actual physical passing away. You see, Dean Martin had experienced the tragic passing away of his son in a plane crash. And when Dean Martin's son passed away, Dean Martin confided in some of his friends, and he said that he had lost all desire to live because he just could not cope with the grief and the sorrow that he felt after his son passed away. His friends tried to cheer him up. Frank Sinatra put together a concert. Maybe he wanted Dean Martin to get back into the swing of things, to find his passion. But no matter what anyone did, Dean Martin could not be pulled from the intensity of the grief and the sorrow that he felt. It is said that Dean Martin would not accept the visits of his friends. When he went to eat, when he went to dine, when he chose to dine, Dean Martin chose to dine by himself, and then he would come back home and watch TV all by himself. You see, the day that Dean Martin's son passed away, 2 people actually died on that day. Dean Martin's son passed away physically, but Dean Martin died on the inside. He felt like an integral part of his life had been taken away from him. And sometimes when a loved one passes away, you feel like a huge part of your life, a huge part of your soul has been ripped out of your heart. I've begun to understand something, that being a Christian does not necessarily mean that you're exempt from the trials and the challenges of life. In fact, Jesus said that in this world you will have trouble. In this life you will have challenges, you will have problems. And I feel that learning to cope with death, learning to cope with the passing away of a loved one is just a normal part of life, even though we struggle we struggle to handle the passing away of a loved one. In 1996, the firstborn in our family, Cuthbert, passed away. And when he passed away, I was probably in my late teens. And as a family, we did not talk about his passing away. We did not talk about the events that led to his passing away. We all tried to come to grips with his passing away in our own individual ways. 2 years later, in 1998, my mom had a stroke. And the doctor said that she had meningitis, and she eventually passed away because of that stroke. And then last year, 2011, in November, my dad suddenly passed away in his sleep. So that's why I'm saying that I am not sharing out of head knowledge. I'm sharing out of the things that I have experienced, the things that I am walking through. And I believe that what I have to share will encourage you in your seasons of loneliness, in your seasons of depression, in your seasons when you're struggling how to cope and you have so many questions and you're trying to understand why certain things happened the way that they did. You know, God has a way of encouraging us even in different ways. He may encourage you through a song, He may encourage you through the word, and He may encourage you through stories. And I want to share two examples, two stories which I feel will be of great benefit. They have helped me in my seasons of grief, sorrow, when I've had questions. And the first story is that of John Walsh, the host of America's Most Wanted, the TV program America's Most Wanted. But John Walsh experienced the passing away of his son Adam. I think Adam was about 6 years old when he was murdered, and out of his grief, John Walsh decided to start America's Most Wanted to prevent, to help prevent or to curb crimes, similar crimes, and because of that, I believe that he's been able to benefit, or thousands of people have benefited from the program. And then the second example that I'm going to share is going to be the example of Glenn Cunningham. You see, Glenn Cunningham was an athlete, and it is said that when Glenn Cunningham was a child, he and his brother were involved in a school fire, and that school fire eventually killed his brother. And it is said that Glenn Cunningham's body was burnt, 90% of his body was burnt. The doctors say that Glenn Cunningham would never ever be able to walk again. In fact, the doctors spoke of amputating his legs. And when Glenn Cunningham heard them talk about amputating his legs, it is said that Glenn Cunningham cried so much that eventually his mom refused for the doctors to amputate his legs. Even though the doctors say that Glenn Cunningham would never be able to walk again, Glenn Cunningham went on to become a world star athlete. He almost broke the 1 mile record before Roger Bannister did. For the rest of his life, Glenn Cunningham had scars on his body because of that school fire. Perhaps those scars were a reminder of the fire and the passing away of his brother. But he went on to defy the odds. He went on to do that which they said was impossible. You see, some people, the point I want to make is this: some people have physical scars, scars that are evident and visible for all, but some people carry emotional scars. They carry scars on the inside of them, scars that are not visible to the natural eye. And for a long time, when my mom passed away, I felt like the lepers in the Bible. The Bible talks about how the lepers had unclean skin conditions, and whenever the lepers would come close to a group, to a crowd, they had to shout, "Unclean, unclean," because it was said that their condition was contagious. Well, when my mom passed away in 96, I felt as if there was an invisible sign over my head that simply shouted, "Unclean, unclean." Even though I was actively involved in ministry, like Dean Martin, I felt like an integral part of my life had been taken away from me. And there's so many people that are struggling to cope with the passing away of a loved one. You have questions that seem unanswered, and there is a grief and a sorrow that you cannot express. I want you to know that the Bible says that God is the God of all comfort. I discovered that whenever the Israelites would mourn for a loved one, whether it was Jacob or Joseph or Moses, one of the things that they would do is they would set aside time to mourn for that person. Sometimes it was 40 days or 20 days. And what they did is they did not focus on the negative. They did not focus on the what ifs. I wish I had spent more time. I wish I had done this. I wish I hadn't done this. You see, whenever a loved one passes away, you will always have the what ifs. You will always have questions. There will always be things that you feel you should have done more or should have done less of. The Israelites focused on the positive. They focused on perhaps the conversations. They focused on the gifts. They focused on the events, the positive things, the imprints that had been left in their hearts. And I am saying that if you're struggling to cope with the passing away of a loved one, you have to make sure that you do not focus on the what ifs, but you focus on the positive moments. If you did not have a good relationship with the person that passed away, focus on the fact that perhaps they simply gave birth to you. Focus on the fact that perhaps you had one good conversation over the phone. There must have been something positive that you can think about, that you can meditate on, but focus on the positive. When Jesus was resurrected, we're told that the woman went to the tomb, and then an angel appeared to them and asked them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" When we have questions, when we ask God, why did my son have to die? Why did my daughter have to die at 6 months or 8 months or a year? Or why did this happen tragically? Why did they have to be involved in a car accident? Why was the death so tragic when this person loved God? When we have so